absolutely delighted you've all come to the Institute for Government this morning for our event with Ambassador Adrian O'Neill. Adrian's been here before. He shows yet again his absolutely impeccable timing, and that's based, I think, on his long understanding of Anglo-Irish, UK-Ireland relations. Those of you that have long memories will remember that we had Ambassador O'Neill here on December the 5th last year. That was the day after the Prime Minister had been forced to leave her lunch with Jean-Claude Juncker on the Monday after that phone call from Arlene Foster, and 3 days before the joint report emerged. So perhaps there is a formula that means that in 3 days' time we are going to get a deal. The Irish ambassador at IFG plus 3 days equals some sort of agreement. Of course, at the moment the negotiators are in the tunnel, and as you can see from the fact that Adrian is here with us now, he is not in the tunnel. So for those of you that want sort of a running test match special style commentary on the state of play of the negotiations, that is not what you're going to get today. So if you wanted that, then go and give your seat to somebody else. But for everybody else, what we're hoping to do is just sort of take stock of where we've got to, how we've got here, and where we might go next on the multiple scenarios that are still in place. So, Adrian, it's an absolute pleasure to have you at Institute for Government to talk about Brexit. So I just thought we might just go back. I know I've just said you're not going to give us a commentary. Where do you think we are now from the sort of, sitting there in the embassy in London, looking at the UK political scene, what's going on? David Liddington on the radio this morning saying he thinks things are getting close. What's your sort of reading of where we've got to on this?
Well, thanks, Jill, and it's very nice to be back in the Institute for Government. I mean, I don't share your assessment about the quality of my sense of timing. I think if a few weeks ago when I accepted this invitation, if I kind of thought that we'd be where we are now, maybe I might have kind of pushed it on a week or gone for last week. But anyway, here we are. Well, I mean, I think as you say, I'm not in the tunnel. I actually think that probably in reality, it's only a very, very small number of people actually who precisely know where we are in relation to the negotiations at this very moment. Those who are in the negotiating teams on both sides, and I think the very small number of people at political level that they are reporting to in Brussels and in London. Certainly Michel Barnier met the EU 27 ministers yesterday and kind of gave them a pretty general briefing in terms of where matters stood, and certainly negotiations were in a very, very intensive phase. I think they had gone on Tuesday morning till 2:45 a.m. is precisely the time I think that was mentioned, and they were resuming engagement again yesterday. And I think the Prime Minister, I was in the Guildhall last night for the Lord Mayor banquet, and the Prime Minister also indicated that the negotiations were at a very, very intensive phase. The issues that they were dealing with were significant, and I think that it remained difficult. So I think that's probably about all I can say at this stage.
So if we wind back a year, so to December last year, when that text was finally hammered out in the joint report, the text on the backstop, it struck some commentators that this was a fudge, and basically everybody had just connived in a sort of form of words just to enable a sufficient progress decision to be made, and actually there were problems down the line. Was that your reading of it at the time, or did you think that gave a very clear way forward for people to then turn into the legal text?
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't see it as a fudge. I mean, I thought it was in terms of the objectives, in terms of a very clear political commitment to the objectives that had to be achieved. It was very clear. The guarantee of there being no hard border on the island of Ireland, of there being no infrastructure related to checks and controls. It's then set out a kind of a menu of modalities for achieving that. Options kind of one, 2, and 3. Option 1 being the objective of no hard border would be achieved through the future partnership agreement, that the nature of that would be such that would deliver the objective. If that wasn't achieved, that the UK government would then bring forward other proposals in terms of how that might be achieved. And if agreement could not be reached on that, well then there would be this backstop arrangement to ensure that Northern Ireland would be sufficiently aligned with the rules of the single market and the customs union to ensure that no hard border, to continue facilitate north-south cooperation, to continue the operation of the all-island economy. So I think that was all. I think that was all very clear in terms of the political objectives to be achieved. But as you say, then the next challenge was to translate that into legal text.
So were you surprised then, given the sort of legal text then emerged at the end of February, were you surprised, given that was just a translation, and presumably in the Irish reading of the commitments in the joint report, that not just the Prime Minister, but basically the entire House of Commons reacted so allergically to the way in which the EU 27 Task Force 50 had decided to translate that into text? Because you're the person who should be watching about and understanding how the UK is going to react to things, the fact that, whereas constitutionally impossible for any Prime Minister ever to sign up to this. Were you taken aback by that, or had you sort of warned Dublin that they were in very tricky territory with this language and translating it into the legal text?
Well, I mean, I think it was, number one, this was work that was obviously being done by the task force, by the Commission task force. I think they were operating on the basis of a good faith legal translation, transposition of the political text. I think they saw it as basically, doing no more or less than what was required to achieve, in legal terms, the objective of the joint report. But one that was very specifically crafted. It was Northern Ireland specific in terms of the joint report. So I mean, I think I probably, I would say I was probably a little bit surprised by the UK government reaction. I can understand why there were perhaps some specific words in the text which people would have had a kind of an allergic reaction to, and I think that's why the Commission task force have made it clear that they were willing to, as Michel Barnier says, to de-dramatise the text in the light of the UK response and reaction, to go back and look again at a term that is, particularly in terms of some of the presentational language that was in the text, and to de-dramatise it and to focus more clearly on what kind of very pragmatic and technical measures or controls would be required to deliver the objective in a Northern Ireland specific context.
So we can de-dramatise the checks, we can be very pragmatic, but if the the Northern Ireland only backstop kicks in, and the view of the Irish government obviously is it has to be potentially something that can kick in on a long-term basis if the first two options don't solve the problem, surely it still leaves this really difficult constitutional issue that part of the UK, Northern Ireland, will be subject to the EU's regulatory regime, be subject to EU trade policy, customs requirements, have zero voice in any of those discussions, maybe have to look to the Republic to represent its interests there, because the UK government will be, or UK GB government will be a third country, not in any of those decision-making processes. So how do you see that actually being a long-term sustainable solution? Doesn't that raise rather more issues of a sort of constitutional nature than whether there are a few more checks on cows on ferries between Stranraer and Larne?
Well, I mean, I think I suppose before we can make any kind of judgment on that, we obviously need to see the text of a withdrawal agreement and what is being very specifically provided for there. I mean, there obviously will be some governance arrangements in terms of the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. There will obviously be some kind of oversight mechanisms that will be required between the EU and the United Kingdom in terms of how the protocol will operate in practice. And I mean, I would imagine that those oversight mechanisms will make some provision for whether it's a UK or a Northern Ireland executive, I don't know precisely how it will be structured, input into the governance arrangements, and presumably that will provide some form of consultative impact that would help to address that democratic aspect that you speak about. But I think, you know, how you put the question is, of course, framing it on the basis of, you know, the glass is inevitably half empty, the way you phrase it, but you can also put it in a way to say that the glass is half full, in the sense that Northern Ireland, in many ways, if in that kind of situation, is going to be in kind of having an opportunity to have the best of both worlds. In terms of being part of the United Kingdom economy and being able to be the beneficiary of all of that, and at the same time having a very privileged and special relationship with the European Union and with the single market. And I would have thought that would confer as well certain advantages on Northern Ireland that would, in economic and trade terms, would be quite helpful. Okay,
it's quite interesting, and actually we were just discussing before we came in quite how quickly the Irish economy is growing, which is quite interesting. 7.3% last year and 7.8% this year, which I think makes it a faster growing economy than places like China. So the Irish economy is clearly not a bad economy to be associated with, but clearly there are a lot of people around who, rather than see my proposition as a glass half empty, see it as a glass almost completely empty, and that's something that we might have to sign up to in terms of this backstop ties us to the EU forever. The Taoiseach suggested a couple of weeks ago, I think, that there could be a review mechanism. Clearly that's where the discussions are now. Did he have anything in mind for a review mechanism that might be acceptable to the UK, i.e. one that doesn't give the final decision to the European Court of Justice? Had he worked up what that might look like?
I don't. I mean, I think that arose in the context of a conversation that he had with the Prime Minister when the Prime Minister called him last week, and my understanding was that in the context of that conversation, the Taoiseach, you know, in seeking to be helpful and seeking to try and find a way forward, because, you know, I mean, it's very much, you know, Ireland wants to see a positive outcome to these negotiations. We obviously want to get a deal. We want an orderly Brexit, in seeking to be helpful to the Prime Minister, he agreed that, you know, we would be willing to look at review mechanisms that might help to give some assurance and confidence here in London, but so long as it was clearly understood that, you know, fundamentally, we couldn't be in a situation where a backstop arrangement, if that's where we were, could be ended unilaterally by one party. That ultimately any decision to end a backstop arrangement could only be by mutual decision. Where we were now transiting into future arrangements, permanent future arrangements, which delivered on the objective of no hard border on the island of Ireland. But I don't think he had any very specific things in mind, and I think the idea that basically was that then was to be basically followed up in the context of discussions in Brussels.
So one of the things that you must be quite worried about is that the Irish backstop as the big barrier, not just to getting an agreement with the EU 27, but as a big barrier to then getting the agreement endorsed by Parliament for the Prime Minister, raises the spectre of no deal. So I just wonder if you might come on to, you know, that clearly is something that the Irish government's been very keen to avoid. We all know that the UK government, UK probably suffers worse from no deal. The next one up on the plate, who is really badly affected by no deal, is Ireland. What What do you expect the European Commission to ask you to do at the border? Their preparedness notice says physical infrastructure will have to be put in place to allow all movements of live animals and animal products, certain plants and plant products, to go through border inspection posts at seaports, at airports, or at land as required by EU rules. That's the EU's preparedness notice that they've issued about the consequences of the UK becoming a third country. So what do you expect to have to do if we end up in no deal? Do you expect to be asked by the EU to put in border inspection posts along those 260, 300 border crossings between the north and the south?
Well, I suppose first, we don't expect to be in a no deal territory. First of all, that's the first thing that I would say.
We're all thinking the unthinkable now, though, and it's rather more thinkable, unthinkable than perhaps it was a year ago. So.
Yes, well, we're all hoping that maybe the next few days might bring some good news, and that we might, have a special European Council in November, but. If that isn't attainable, there is still we can still aim towards the December European Council and so forth. So it's never over until it's over. But what the Taoiseach has made it clear that in terms of our own contingency and preparedness arrangements, we are well advanced on that. We are certainly working at preparedness arrangements in relation to, for example, on an east-west basis in relation to the ports in terms of east-west trade, and we're employing additional customs officers and all of that. But we're not advancing any preparations in respect of the land border. The Taoiseach has made it clear that that's something that basically he is not willing to contemplate. But we will. If we did find ourselves in the scenario that you outlined, no doubt there would be some very challenging circumstances, because we would, Taoiseach, because of all of the history of the island of Ireland, and because of the political situation and the sensitivity of the peace process, and the fragility of the peace process at the current moment, the Taoiseach would be very, very reluctant to contemplate any such eventuality. On the other hand, we do have our obligations to the European Union in terms of the single market and the customs union. So I think I would expect that there would have to be some very serious conversations with Brussels about how we try and manage that very difficult situation.
In those sort of circumstances, is there not a temptation, if it really looks like the deal will sort of falter on this, to say actually the UK government was right all along? The UK government always took the view that Ireland was a phase 2 issue that could only be solved by the future relationship, and that actually the reason we got ourselves tangled up into the Northern Ireland specific backstop is we've tried to solve a phase 2 issue in phase 1. And actually, if there's the money on the table, there's the guarantees for citizens' rights, there's everything there except this pesky backstop that we need, and there's proving difficulties. Isn't it going to be a temptation just to say, actually, let's just agree best endeavours that we'll solve this into phase 2 and kick the can down into the longer term relationship negotiations? Do you see that as a possible way out if we don't emerge out of the tunnel with a decent deal on the backstop?
Well, I think one of the reasons that why Ireland and indeed the EU 27 insisted that this issue be addressed up front as part of the withdrawal agreement was, from the get-go, from the moment the referendum occurred, we understood the implications of that decision and of UK exit in terms of the peace process in Northern Ireland, of how potentially destabilising that would be. And that, therefore, there needed to be the earliest possible assurance to people in Northern Ireland that we would not end up in a situation where the gains of the peace process and indeed as parts of the Good Friday Agreement would be undermined by Brexit. And in the 2 years which have elapsed since then, the conditions, Northern Ireland relationships have deteriorated. Most obviously politically between the parties, but also between communities on the ground. That's been acknowledged, including by UK ministers. And so, I mean, we shouldn't underestimate the degree of worry and concern that there is actually about the potential impact of Brexit. And that's why we and the EU27 were insistent that the issue be dealt with early in the negotiations. If we left it to the future relationship in whatever time scale the future relationship is going to be, if we had left it to that phase and just allowed the situation in Northern Ireland to drift, and for those concerns and worries to deepen and so on, I think that would have been very irresponsible.
Let's turn to the future relationship. We talked a lot. Let's assume we get over our difficulties at the moment and get a withdrawal agreement, and then we move into negotiating the long-term economic relationship. Could we, Prime Minister Checker's plan hasn't got huge amounts of support, I think it's fair to say here, but surely the sort of government that actually should be the biggest cheerleader for Chequers is the Irish government. It gives you almost everything you could possibly want in terms of friction-free trade, and yet the ability to attract loads of English-speaking services businesses over to Dublin or Cork or wherever you might. So what will you be arguing for that the EU should be trying to do with the UK in that long-term economic partnership?
Well, I mean, I think the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach Simon Coveney have made it clear for quite some time that in terms of the future relationship negotiations, that Ireland will be, using our influence, whatever influence we have in those negotiations, to try and achieve the closest possible economic, trade and economic and indeed broader partnership with the UK. Because it's, in terms of that in terms of our bilateral trade and business relationship, it will be easier to sustain that in the context of a very close relationship between the EU and the UK. So you were right. I mean, when Chequers was published, the Irish government welcomed the proposals as a very positive contribution in terms of the future relationship. And I think when we get to that future relationship phase, I mean, at the moment, obviously, the issue of Northern Ireland and the backstop and so forth is as part of this withdrawal phase. I mean, that's such an existential interest for us that we have to adopt a very robust approach in the negotiations. But in terms of the future relationship, I think we will be certainly one within the EU27 who will be pressing for the closest possible relationship that we have. Now, I'll make one caveat to that and qualification to that, which is to say that, of course, that relationship, has to be achieved without fundamentally compromising or damaging the single market of the European Union, and that will be something which all member states will insist upon. And Ireland also is very mindful of that, because I mean, you referred to our economic growth rates and all of that, but one of the major reasons, of course, why our economy has been doing so well is precisely because we have access to that single market. We are beneficiaries of that single market. We export a huge amount of what we produce. A lot of our FDI, foreign direct investment in recent years, has been achieved because US companies come into Ireland because of the access we grant to the single market. So it's not in Ireland's interest either to be damaging the single market.
I want to talk just briefly about one aspect of the future partnership. We talk a lot about the future economic partnership, and clearly there, subject to the single market rules, etc., and the UK quite well aligned. It's another area where actually the two countries have benefited enormously from the working within the EU umbrella, which is on security cooperation, internal security cooperation. We've heard, and I think there's quite a lot of evidence being given by things like the police service of Northern Ireland, that they're really worried about the loss of things like the European arrest warrant, lack of sort of information sharing through the various systems. We touched on that in a report that we did earlier this year. Just wondered, that people are very worried that if there isn't a sort of full-blown security partnership that more or less replicates the arrangements we have now, that will return to sort of bad old days of sort of politicised extradition, and that sort of essential seamless cooperation will end. So how much is Ireland going to be able to argue for a pragmatic view of that? Because there's some people that say actually that can't happen because as a third country, the UK won't meet EU data standards and stuff like that, you know, and the European arrest warrant won't work because you're not an EU member state, you can't have that, or whatever. Where do you see the security partnership going? Because I think it's very critical for both sides, given the security situation in the island of Ireland.
Yeah, well, I mean, those issues obviously are going to be part of the future relationship discussions and negotiations. But you're right. I mean, we do have a lot of skin in the game, so to speak, in relation to the outcome of those aspects. And the government will be listening very, very carefully to what our own police service, the Garda Síochána, and indeed the police service of Northern Ireland say to us about these matters. I mean, I'm long enough in the Irish diplomatic service to remember the days before the European arrest warrant and the bilateral extradition procedures between Ireland and Britain during the Troubles, and all of the difficulties they caused and the controversies they caused when you had a bilateral extradition warrant for some, you know, being found to be flawed by a court and thrown out, and then the brouhaha that would emerge in Parliament and the media and so forth and things like that, and the issue inevitably becoming politicised and so on. And none of us want to go back to that. I mean, the European arrest warrant has been a really effective mechanism in terms of cross-border security and justice cooperation. And we certainly don't want to go back to a kind of a bilateral process which doesn't serve us well. So I think, I mean, we certainly will be hoping that we can find some way through there that will, in some fashion, however it's done, replicate the kind of the outcomes that we've been able to enjoy in recent years.
Okay, I'm going to go to questions. I've got quite a lot more questions for Ambassador O'Neill, but I imagine you do too. If anyone is in the overspill room and wants to ask a question, they have to, I fear, walk into this room and wave their hand. So let's take questions. We're going to take them in groups. So anyone want to ask a question? Okay. So Adela, if you just go to the row behind you, let's be very efficient, and let's do 3 in a row. And can you tell us who you are?
Yes, I'll stand up actually. John Peet from The Economist. I wonder, Ambassador, if you have any worries about the sustainability of the common travel area in the long run. We don't quite know what the UK's immigration policy will be, but one possibility favoured by many people in the government is to treat EU citizens the same as non-EU citizens. Does that, if that happened, would that raise questions about the CTA?
Okay. Next.
Peter Kellner, formerly of YouGov. Occasionally we'll get talk from Brexiteers saying it doesn't matter how bad the deal is, let's just get to March the 29th, because if we don't like it, we can come into government and we can tear it up. Does this talk concern you, and is it possible to make the withdrawal agreement proof against being torn up by a subsequent British government?
Okay, yes.
Hi, Aaron Nelson from Bertram Dyson Bell. We're a law firm here in Westminster. I'd just like an assessment from the Ambassador about the likelihood of dissident Irish Republican violence in the event of the imposition of UK infrastructure on the border in the event of either no deal or a deal that involved or required that.
Well, that's wide-ranging questions, as
Okay.
you might expect. Let's start with John's question about the common travel. That's been the sort of relatively easy thing to get over the line, actually, isn't it? The common travel area obviously predated membership, etc., or whatever. Are you looking at what the UK might do on migration policy and thinking, can we really sustain this long term? Or are you relatively sanguine that we're okay on the CTA?
Yeah, well, you know, the devil is always in the detail, and you know, I'm not complacent about the CTA, but I am relatively sanguine that's in a good space. I mean, the UK has indicated that has given a formal indication as well that even in a no deal scenario, it's committed to maintaining the CTA, and there's a lot of work going on bilaterally now between Dublin and London, looking at all aspects of the CTA, because it's not just about travel. It's also about the kind of the related rights of access to employment and to services, and there's voting rights and all of that. And so kind of beneath that kind of just free right of travel, kind of cascades down from that is quite a complex kind of nexus of rights, and there's a lot of work going on between the relevant departments in London and Dublin, saying, okay, well, how do we basically kind of now kind of codify that and ensure that we lock down the administrative detail and that we then share the information and provide the information. And of course, it's not just for Irish citizens in Britain; it's also for UK citizens in Ireland. The same reciprocal rights. I mean, in terms of one in the joint report, the one aspect of the joint report, that there was a commitment in the joint report back in December that the UK specifically acknowledged that the CTA, the operation of the CTA, would have to operate without in any way prejudicing the rights of EU citizens from the EU 26, their right in respect of free movement to Ireland. And that was in the joint report. So I think what you were maybe thinking of, John, is what if there is a visa requirement imposed on then EU citizens coming into Britain? How would that operate in terms of the land border? And so would be a requirement on Ireland to therefore kind of police our land border in terms of? And I think the answer is I think on the joint report that would not arise. But obviously we are watching with interest the UK's wider plans in terms of immigration, and I know the white paper will arrive one of these days, and so we're watching all of that, because there are some potential read-across implications.
I think the white paper is always about 2 or 3 months away, and has been for really quite a long time. So let's go to Peter's question. We've got a lot of people, this is thought to be one of the sort of Prime Minister's almost arguments for getting to March 29th, that you can get some people there that they're not very committed. And we've seen a sort of series of things. I mean, straight after the joint report last year, David Davis decided to go on the Mars show and say, "Oh, we've signed up to this, but that's not legally binding. We can always, whatever. So we don't have to take it too seriously." Obviously, by the 29th of March, we have a legally binding treaty for the Withdrawal Agreement, but the political declaration on the future framework is just so many words. Sounds like it's going to be a lot of words if it's really the 500 pages the BBC is claiming it's going to be. How worried are you that basically the UK leaves and then just says we're off and we're not going to recognise any of those commitments that we made before? Yeah,
well, I wouldn't say we're terribly worried about that. You might accuse us of being naive, but I mean we still think that international agreements mean some things, and the United Kingdom is a very serious country which takes its international responsibilities very seriously. I think there would be a withdrawal agreement there. That would be a legal treaty between the European Union and the United Kingdom. You're right, what we would have in respect of the future relationship is a political declaration. The detail of the future relationship would have to be negotiated. Those negotiations would only begin in earnest after March. So you can imagine that perhaps there clearly would be some scope for flexibility or development or evolution between the political declaration and the final content of the future of the future relationship deal. But in respect of the withdrawal agreement, I mean, I would expect that would be pretty very solid. I would expect that any UK government would meet its commitments. And I mean, I think apart from anything else, if the UK government, on the one hand, was around the world seeking to negotiate trade deals with third countries and was adopting a very nonchalant attitude to respecting its commitments in another recently concluded international agreement, I don't imagine that would leave you in a very good space in terms of attracting negotiating partners. So I mean, you know, in fact, I mean, I would be pretty confident that the withdrawal agreement would hold in all circumstances.
So where it obviously gets difficult, because the bit of the withdrawal agreement links into the future relationship is through the famous Northern Ireland, non-Northern Ireland backstop. If a future UK government said, well, you know, maybe a different political hue, that can mean anything here these days, but we have a government that says, actually, we signed up to this sort of deal on Northern Ireland. We think we've got perfectly reasonable arrangements. Maybe the review mechanism, maybe whatever doesn't quite agree, but we think we've got perfectly reasonable mechanisms. And Northern Ireland's going to actually stay with us, and we're going to subject it to UK customs, UK tariffs, UK regulatory rules. How actually does that get enforced in Northern Ireland? I mean, you can't exactly send in a task force to sort of, you know, say, no, those chlorinated chickens have to be seized at the Northern Irish ports. How does that work?
Well, let's wait till we see the draft withdrawal agreement. I mean, we know that an awful lot of work has been done by the task force in terms of the de-dramatising of the backstop arrangement and so on. We know that is now a very technical document. And there's an awful lot of detail in it, including in relation to the protocol in Ireland and Northern Ireland. So, I think we should suspend judgment until we actually see it.
And finally, the question there about
from Aaron. Yeah, I mean, I think I take seriously the assessment of the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland and of the Garda Síochána, and indeed the UK government's own assessment that the threat from dissident Republicans remains severe. Now, happily, in recent years, the police cooperation between the PSNI and the Garda Síochána has been such that dissident Republicans have had very little space in which to operate, and while they still have a murderous intent, and if they had opportunities to kill PSNI officers, they would avail of those opportunities. So they still have that intent, but their capability has been much reduced, and they don't have any significant traction within the broader community, and they don't really have a cause. But I think the real fear would be that border installations emerging in any fashion gives them a cause. Then you could find ourselves in a kind of a descending spiral that any border installations, cameras or whatever they are vandalised. There's a demand then that they be protected, and then we get kind of more elaborate kind of infrastructure around them. They get attacked. The next requirement is that therefore you have some kind of manned defence around them, and then you have, PSNI officers being put into vulnerable situations and so forth.
That by hyping up the border as this massive issue, you've almost got into a position where no self-respecting dissident couldn't blow up a sort of little virtually invisible roadside camera, because it's become such a touchstone that it's almost become a self-predicting prophecy that they'll get blown up, because we've all been saying this is such a major issue, whereas otherwise just a bit of low-level technology, would anyone really have noticed?
Well, again, I mean, I wouldn't want to second guess I wouldn't want to second guess the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland on this, and I mean he's been very clear on this, including in terms of giving evidence in Parliament here and so forth. So, and you know, I mean, the fact of the matter is that, you know, PSNI officers, there are still parts of Northern Ireland down around the border where it's are still kind of no-go areas for PSNI officers.
Let's have some more questions. So let's go here. Della, Elliot, if you could go to the back there. Thanks. Yes.
Rob Douglas. It strikes me that one of the problems in the negotiations between the UK and the EU is the different legal systems, that the EU sees this as a very legal process, and that comes out of the Roman law system, whereas the UK, with its common law, sees it as a pragmatic negotiation. Now, once Britain has left, the only country in the EU, I think this is right, with a common law system will be Ireland. Do you think that will afford Ireland a chance to be a bridge between a UK outside the EU and the EU? Because I think there's such misunderstanding between the two systems and how they work, and you have a foot in each camp.
Okay. Yeah, and the back.
Hans van Leeuwen from the Australian Financial Review newspaper. I went to a press conference yesterday where the leaders of the non-DUP parties in Northern Ireland sort of, I paraphrase, but they said, you know, a can of worms has been opened, and at some point they're now going to have to put the question to the people of Northern Ireland as to what, you know, what they want their future to be. Do they want to join the Republic or remain with the UK? What would be the Irish government's sort of view if Northern Ireland, in its wisdom, decided to have a referendum? Because I believe it needs some kind of sanction from both governments.
Okay, yes.
Donald McCarthy, RSPB. What sort of guarantees is the Irish government looking for on this issue of the level playing field for social and environmental standards as part of the all UK customs backstop? This is obviously something that seems to be a bit of a sticking point in the current negotiations, but would be interesting to hear your perspective from outside the tunnel.
Okay, that's it's a pretty wide-ranging set of questions. So Rob's point about different legal systems, are you a bridge, or are you actually worried that without the UK there, the direction the EU takes will actually be one that may be a bit more inimical to the Irish approach than one where the UK has been relatively influential, if we dare say that? But anyway.
Yeah, well, I think I think that is certainly. I mean, I don't actually. I mean, whether that's threat or opportunity, I have to say I'm not quite sure, to be honest. I mean, I know there's certainly a lot of interest within the legal professions in Ireland and indeed within our judiciary in engaging more with their counterparts over here to kind of discuss and analyse all of this, and we're certainly seeing, I think, over the last couple of years as well, a lot of Irish law firms opening offices in London, and conversely, UK law firms here opening offices in Dublin. So I know that this is something which the legal specialists are increasingly engaged in discussing and analysing. Where the centre of gravity is in it, I don't really have a sense as yet. I think the way you phrased the question there, Jill, though kind of puts a I think does illustrate a broader point about the UK leaving the European Union does have lots of implications about the future direction of the Union, in terms of its policies and so forth. And Ireland and the UK have been very, very like-minded in a lot of major, internal policies within the European Union in recent years. Probably the only real exception was the common agricultural policy, where we have divergent approaches. But, for example, in relation to the single market, there has been we have worked very, very closely together in terms of wanting to, broaden and deepen the operation of the single market. And those dynamics now internally will change within the European Union, and that will be a challenge for Ireland, and it will be a challenge for other like-minded EU member states. So we're going to have to be a good deal, maybe more agile and so on, in terms of kind of creating new alliances and so forth within the EU.
Prospects for a border poll?
Prospects for border poll, right, Hans' question. Well, what I say in that is that I think one of the difficulties in terms of Brexit in Northern Ireland is that it has become, the question of how we manage Brexit has become kind of conflated with the kind of the green-orange divide, which has made it very difficult to manage because the political temperatures have escalated. But the Irish government position in that is that the question of sovereignty in Northern Ireland is solely determined by the Good Friday Agreement, by the consent provisions of the Good Friday Agreement, which basically require that any change in sovereignty would have to be by a majority of the people living in Northern Ireland. How that would be tested would be by a border poll, and a border poll would only arise if the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland judged that it was likely that such a border poll would result in a majority for change. So the test really is the Secretary of State of the day must be presented with prima facie kind of evidence which suggests that a border poll would be likely to result in a change. And I think there is the view of the Irish government is that such a border poll now at this point would be unlikely to result in such a change, and therefore to hold one in current circumstances when we're trying to grapple with Brexit, grapple with the absence of devolved institutions in Northern Ireland, would probably be divisive and unhelpful at the moment.
There was quite an interesting piece in the Irish Times a couple of weeks ago by Fintan O'Toole called "Here's How Post-Brexit Ireland Could Turn Out," which presents a rather sort of grim vision of an unravelling UK and a Northern Ireland that voted to join the Republic and the Republic not really wanting it. I wonder whether that had got much sort of interest and traction in Irish circles, doing rounds on Twitter of people saying there's quite an interesting, slightly apocalyptic vision of where things might be going.
Well, I mean, I think Brexit represents has put some pressure on the Good Friday Agreement, and it's put some pressure on the devolved settlement more generally across the UK. I mean, this whole debate about the repatriation of powers from Brussels that will come back to the devolved administrations, and how they're handled, and do they go to London or do they go back to Edinburgh and Cardiff, and then what kind of frameworks have to be put in place. All of these things, are kind of have implications for that. And I mean, I've no doubt that if we ended up with in a hard Brexit and a hard border, that would obviously have implications, maybe not immediately, but I think down the line for Northern Ireland and for the degree to which the views and opinions of people in Northern Ireland about a united Ireland would change. It could potentially shift the dial, because of course in those circumstances, if you were minded to consider a united Ireland, there now is two reasons why you might find that positively attractive. Number one, because if you're a nationalist, a united Ireland may well appeal to you as your ultimate aspiration. And secondly, it gets you back into the European Union. So I think, in terms of long term, I think in the long term, particularly if we ended up with a hard Brexit or a hard border, it could potentially shift the dial on that issue in terms of where a majority of the people of Northern Ireland would find themselves.
Yeah. So Donald's point here about the sort of, if you like, temporary customs union plus, that having thought, Theresa May's temporary customs arrangement she floated in the summer was really just about customs, maybe with VAT as well. But we're told that the EU is keen to add level playing field provisions. We always know Northern Ireland's been a bit of an Achilles heel, say, on environmental enforcement, to add fisheries into the deal as well, that you don't get, don't get to take back control of our fishing waters. We know it's quite a difficult issue for the government. With the temporary customs union. What's the sort of Irish government's view to all these sort of added things being put into the whatever? I think the Taoiseach said that you did need loads of level playing field provisions and proper enforcement of them if you were going to have this sort of arrangement.
Well, I suppose the reason that they're added, and because they have kind of just now kind of come into focus now, is because they're a consequence of the UK government's success in effectively shifting the EU 27 to consider a UK-wide customs agreement as part of the backstop. That had long been a UK objective. The Commission Task Force view until reasonably recently was that wouldn't be possible, that a UK-wide customs arrangement as part of the backstop wouldn't be possible to negotiate for a number of reasons, including the fact that it would require all these level playing field issues to be addressed. If we were just operating on a Northern Ireland specific backstop arrangement, then the level playing field issues could be left for negotiation as part of the future relationship negotiations. But because now, in order to get a deal, we need to have some kind of UK-wide customs arrangement.
So why does level playing field matter for customs? I mean, after all, if you look at CETA allows pretty much free trade without tariffs on most goods between whatever. It's not single market access. So why suddenly, if the UK wants effectively sort of free trade, put in place the common external tariff, customs union, why does that have to come with all the baggage of level playing field provisions? What's the logic there?
Well, it's because if the UK was effectively in a customs union, but didn't have to abide by all these a level playing field environment, it would confer very significant competitive advantage on the UK, which and the UK is such a major economy. You're talking about a major economy in the heart of Europe, and the EU 27. The view of the EU 27 was this was always going to have to be part of the negotiation.
So one of the things that we're told what they want to put in a level playing field agreement is tax. The UK government's had to devolve corporation tax to Northern Ireland because of the Republic's 12% corporation tax rate. So does a level playing field cut both ways, that if we're forced to sign up to these level playing field provisions, Ireland will have to raise its corporation tax rate? Because that's caused real difficulties for the North.
Well, it's interesting that you should mention that, because it's the UK government has accepted in principle the request from the Northern Ireland Executive a number of years ago that it be allowed to set its own differential corporate tax rate, and it's kind of puzzled me to some extent that those people who've been saying that when we were talking about Northern Ireland specific backstop that we couldn't possibly have it, that we couldn't have anything that was differential from the rest of the UK, that differential customs arrangements were verboten and an appalling vista, but somehow differential corporate tax rate, well, that was perfectly fine, and so on. But that it was, I always wondered about the consistency of that. But I suppose the answer to the question is that within the European Union, the question of tax rates was always a sovereign and national competence and a matter for the sovereign decision of national governments, and we have so that's what we have availed of, and that's what we think has served us well.
I think that's something the UK and Ireland's always agreed on, actually. So
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we would welcome the fact. I mean, if hopefully we will, if we can get back onto some kind of stable trajectory in relation to Brexit, and there's a real opportunity to get the institutions back in Northern Ireland operating up again, and they get their their differential tax rate and etc. We would welcome and support that.
Okay, let's have last questions. We've got loads flocking up. So, Elliot, if you could go to the back. Adela down here. So. behind you. Yeah.
All the talk of level playing fields has...
Can you tell us who you are?
Chris Brannigan, I'm former political advisor. The talk of level playing fields has made me wonder what prospects there are for the future of the Irish Rugby Football Union team. I wonder whether or not they should provide a model for what should be a pragmatic basis for the bilateral relationship between the UK and Ireland after we left the European Union.
Interesting, slightly left field question, but yes, thank you.
Rosaline Hughes. There are growing calls in Britain for another referendum with Remain as one of the options on the paper. I wonder if you could offer some helpful advice from the Irish experience on how to hold a referendum where you get the right answer.
Okay, of course the IFG has no view on what the right answer in another referendum would be if there were one. And down here. And let's just take the remaining two and then we'll get Adrian to answer those. And
Paul Wallace, I'm a journalist. You've mentioned the corporate tax rate being a sovereign matter, but Ireland has received a fantastic amount of support from the EU 26. It tends to operate on a quid pro quo basis. Are you concerned about the fact that without the UK as a powerful ally for maintaining tax rates within as a sovereign issue, that it will be difficult for Ireland to reject again raising the corporate tax rate?
okay, let's just take the last two questions. So there, if you could hand the mic back, and if Elliot could get the mic there. Yes.
Robert Morland, I'm a former member of the European Parliament. I've had the comment from Irish businessmen quite often that put aside the Northern Ireland issue, Ireland has a total history, unlike any other EU country, of free trade, obviously, with the UK, and we will be affected, and seriously affected. I was reading this morning an article in the Times which says British business is very critical but doesn't speak out. I'm wondering what points business is putting to you. I would have thought they're concerned.
Okay, and final question, yes.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist. I would like to have a very beginner's questions. So constructive ambiguity and then self-determination by Northern Ireland to someday. So goods export from the Great Britain to Northern Ireland is very small. And also export of this to Ireland is very limited. Why this very small economical issue is sticking point? Yeah. And my guess is it's a political bullying on the UK, or you want to UK to remain or to have a second referendum. And politically, Northern Ireland issue must be fuzzy and ambiguity. And why you would like to take a very clear decision at this time?
Okay, so I think goes into the sort of phasing thing. So let's take all of those. Prospects for the Ireland rugby team.
Okay,
surely they just go
right.
on, don't they?
Yeah, well, yes, I mean, Chris's point about the Irish rugby team, they're an all-Ireland team. They have been for many years. The ladies, the Irish ladies hockey team that got to the surprised us all and got to the final of the World Cup finals here in London in July, are also an all-Ireland team as well. And indeed many sports are on an all-Ireland basis, and I think that is to be welcomed and encouraged. And even during the bad days of the Troubles, the all-Ireland, the rugby team operated on an all-Ireland basis and was a kind of a network for contacts and dialogue across the island when there weren't too many others around. But I think Chris, what I say is in terms of pragmatic, one thing I would say is that I suppose inevitably the last couple of years of Brexit being dominating the dialogue and the discussion between the two governments has meant to a certain kind of a bit of stress and strain in the relationship. But I think the fundamentals of that relationship are very strong. I think there's a determination both in London and Dublin to ensure that whatever happens in Brexit, that the relationship doesn't suffer in terms of collateral damage. There's a good bit of thinking going on already about, after the UK leaves the European Union, and given that ministers will no longer be meeting in Brussels on a daily basis and all of that, how do we make sure that the bilateral relationship remains as close and as positive as it has been? And I think you will see proposals being brought forward in pretty soon in terms of how we try and do that.
Do you expect the EU to exact a price in terms of they don't like your corporation tax rate either? I think it's Paul's question. Are there going to be quid pro quos for their so far unbending support for Ireland in the Brexit negotiations?
Yeah, well, just in relation to taxation issues generally, I would say it's not that Ireland is opposed to any reform in relation to taxation and corporate taxation and how we address that. But we think the right forum to deal with that is within the OECD. We have been very much part of the BEPS process in the OECD to address those issues, because if you're going to take an equitable approach, an equitable solution on tax requires a global approach, and just the EU doing it on its own isn't going to address the challenges.
Are you going to veto the digital services tax then that the EU's?
Germans
apparently want a decision in December on that.
Usually
you can rely on the UK to veto a tax proposal.
Well, along with some other member states, we have concerns about that, and we'll engage in the debate.
Just a bit of comments about sort of the significance of the Northern Irish economy, but also the view of Irish businesses. Irish businesses must be getting quite worried. The Taoiseach and the Taoiseach have been doing these road shows, haven't they, about no deal preparations, and the British government has been referring people to the Irish government website if they want to know about how business in the island of Ireland will continue after Brexit. Just what's the sort of view of your government's posture that your businesses are taking?
Yeah, well, the business. Obviously, business are concerned, and they're doing a lot of contingency planning and a lot of preparedness work. 15% of Irish exports still come to Britain. In the case of food and drinks, that's 35%, and so on. So yes, they're concerned, and they certainly would like to see a deal and would like to see a future relationship which was the closest possible relationship. But I would say it's also a two-way street. Ireland is the 5th largest export market for the United Kingdom. Something like over 100,000 people in Britain are employed by affiliates of companies that are Irish owned, and the UK exports, I think, considerably more to Ireland than it does to China. And so, this is very much a two-way street. It's not just, in terms of business generally, it shouldn't be just, Irish business who would be concerned if we ended up with any kind of barriers to trade.
So, final question, let's go to Rosaline's question.
Yes.
If there's another referendum, any sort of observations as a country that's much more used to holding referenda than we are about how to do it right? And yesterday, Gordon Brown here said we need to have a national dialogue, what he called a People's Royal Commission, which seems a slight oxymoron to some of us, but he's a former Prime Minister, so he can get away with that. But he drew very strongly on the experience of Ireland with its Citizens' Assembly charting a way forward before your abortion referendum. I just wonder if you finally had any helpful advice for where the UK goes next in the most diplomatic possible way, of course, Adrian.
Well, yeah, I'm certainly going to say our experience in referenda, and we've had different experiences, but even in the European ones where we had a second referendum, that was always after a period of significant reflection about what it was that was the problem and the difficulty. Why was it that people, had the issue? What was the issue that basically, prevented them from voting with the proposal that the government was advancing, and then saying, having identified that, then saying, okay, well, let's then go and basically go back to the European Union and negotiate the kind of assurances and so on that are required to address those concerns. And then we held a second referendum when we had a package to offer to people to say, look, here were the concerns. They're now being addressed in a certain way, and etc. And will you think again? In relation to the ones more recently, as you say, that we had in relation to the abortion referendum, yes, we had this very kind of, I suppose, longitudinal, deliberative process involving not just the Citizens' Assembly, but then also Parliament as well, a parliamentary committee taking the work and the report of the Citizens' Assembly, also having a process of dialogue and discussion around that, and then formulating the question to be put to the people. And it did produce, I think, a very surprising result. Surprising in the sense is that if you had thought about this issue in advance and would say, very, very sensitive issue, perhaps the people of Ireland would be willing to contemplate voting for some kind of abortion, but in very, very limited and defined circumstances and so on, and by a very, very narrow margin. And in fact, the referendum actually was not a narrow margin, it was a 2-to-1 a vote in favour. And I think it just shows that actually, when you produce the evidence to the people, when you go to it's evidential based and you produce the evidence and so on, I mean, that does, carry sway.
Okay, I think that's a very good point to end on. Thank you all very much for coming. Our next Brexit event is next week. We have Bernard Jenkin coming to tell us what he thinks will make a successful Brexit. That's a relatively rare opportunity here to hear somebody on the Leave side putting their case. So do come and put all your questions to him. But meanwhile, could I thank Adrian O'Neill for being so open and